Hey, it's Globby Bobby. So there's this idea of thinking critically or thinking for yourself,
which is good.
but it feels antithetical to compel someone to think for themselves. This then creates some sort of dilemma which fundamentally breaks the notions of individuality and free thinking. But that leads to cracks along the foundations of education and progressive human knowledge itself. How can either of these exist without presenting some existential dread that there is no right belief, and instead we are like mice crawling around in the dark, clutching on to any little crumb or morsel of some self-proclaimed truth or divine providence? So here's the argument. Telling people to think for themselves does not work. You want people to think critically, so you tell them that they need to think for themselves. Therefore, anything that comes from that is a result of them listening to you. Therefore, they aren't really thinking for themselves. And therefore, telling people to think for themselves does not work. This creates two different ideas of critical thinking, which I'll label CC and CD, where CC represents compelled critical thinking and CD, which is discovered critical thinking. CC must be inferior to CD because compelled critical thinking is easier to develop, which means the act of discovering ideas is lost, which is fundamentally what critical thinking is trying to foster. So here's the dilemma. You want to encourage these ideas, whether that be compelled critical thinking or discovered critical thinking. And there isn't really any argument against critical thinking. There's plenty of books that already stress how important it is for you to form your own opinions, like the Dune series and Animal Farm, which I think does a better job of that than 1984. The problem with critical thinking is that you can only achieve a true level of unique thought through achieving it by yourself. Again, the argument is that critical thinking brought about by compulsion is not true critical thinking. Let me put it in another way. From a utilitarian perspective, everything revolves around maximizing happiness. Thus, critical thinking must exist to reach that purpose in some respect. Critical thinking allows for maximizing judgment, which then allows for the maximization of happiness. Thus, the idea is that critical thinking should be used to further one's judgment. CC exists on the ideas of another, so it can only develop the judgment of someone else. Thus, the idea is that critical thinking should be used to further one's judgment. Compelled critical thinking exists on the ideas of another, so it can only develop the judgment of someone else, which fundamentally fails to value the happiness of oneself. Discovered critical thinking is built on your own ideas, and thus validates your own judgment, and thereby your own happiness. There is a counterpoint in how much an individual knows best for themselves, but the arguing of that point trivializes the whole value or notion of critical thinking within individuals. In other avenues of thought, critical thinking is still wildly important, and if they value individual thought, then compelled critical thinking cannot compare to discovered critical thinking. All in all, that means that to compel someone to think critically is an oxymoron in both definition and purpose. But then, what direction do you walk towards? Don't teach critical thinking and hope people can reach that higher benchmark? Or teach them and thus deprive them of that level, only able to reach some elevated status that isn't quite true enlightenment? Should you really just do nothing? Leave everyone to their own devices, acting purely on self-preservation, hoping that every single individual might gain this understanding? It would be really unsatisfying to end the video like this. But maybe that is it. The only way to live without contradiction is for nothing to exist or to hold value. The end is simply just the end, and nothing more. Something like this doesn't get to have an ending, or a moral, or a call to action. Any call to action fundamentally misunderstands the lesson here. I can't tell you what to do or what to think, because that's kind of up to you. The only thing I can do is simply to do just as I do. Something that I found from ostensibly ignoring other people's advice is that I end up learning the same lesson just through a different avenue. Most of the time, people are generally right, but I don't learn anything from taking someone else's word for it. I try a thing for myself, and eventually I'll figure out the lesson that I should have learned already. But the fundamental difference here is that the discovery of that idea came from me. And the lesson that you learn is always going to be more impactful than something that someone else tells you. Constructivism is a theory that people don't learn through direct instruction, but through building off of previous knowledge. If you think back to how you've learned anything, you don't just learn a new concept. You rope in ideas from old concepts and you combine them together to create a new concept that is still based on these fundamental principles that you've learned just through living your life. Everyone always has that one piece of advice that changed their life forever. But try to think about a piece of advice that someone has told you that you haven't already figured out for yourself. To be more specific, try to think of a piece of advice that you haven't latched onto yourself, and it's just something that someone told you that you may have thought, that's pretty useful, but you've never actually discovered it for yourself. There's nothing there, right? My experiences shape who I am. That's obvious. What's less obvious is that I can't do much to shape your experiences. The best I can do is keep doing my own thing, and maybe someone will see what I have and connect that to something that they've already lived. My best advice is to stop listening to other people's advice. It's a bit paradoxical, but any advice that someone else gives you either won't be retained by you or is something that you have already subconsciously discovered. There's no call to action here. Obviously not. But the best I can say is maybe you just need to come up with your own ideas.
Freeloader.
It's not really a story, is it? A story like this doesn't get to have an ending? Something like this doesn't get to have an ending.